Hello there. This week's installment of the Far Middle marks the final episode in the month of October, if you can believe that. So happy Halloween, one day in advance, and let's get rolling with those weekly connections. Oh, before we do, this is Nick DeOlius, your host. You can access archived episodes of the Far Middle along with this current installment across Amazon, Apple, and Spotify platforms, as well as on nickdeolius.com, my website. A lot of good stuff sitting, waiting to be enjoyed and consumed from prior years in the Far Middle archives. Our sports dedication is a fun one, and I suspect most constant listeners are unaware of it ever happening. But you're going to find it quite entertaining. And it involves baseball, since we're wrapping up another playoff and season. And it was an altercation between a group of big names during 1970s baseball, which many of you might know is my favorite era of baseball. The names involved include Hall of Famer Ted Simmons, pitcher and eccentric personality Al Hrabosky, and consummate hitter Bill Madlock. Now, Madlock was with the Cubs, while Simmons and Hrabosky were with the Cardinals, and the incident, the fight, occurred in St. Louis in Old Busch Stadium. Madlock was at the plate, Al Hrabosky was pitching, and Simmons was catching, and the date was September 22nd, 1974. Now, you can view the following festivities that I'm about to describe on YouTube. Just type in something like a Madlock-Hrabosky fight, and it'll pop right up. And it's the top of the ninth, and the game's tied 5-5. Al Hrabosky is pitching for the Cardinals, and Bill Madlock was to lead off the inning for the visiting Cubs. And the Mad Hungarian Al Hrabosky had already pitched the eighth inning without incident, but apparently Bill Madlock didn't care for the pre-pitch ritual that Hrabosky, nicknamed the Mad Hungarian, as I said, was famous for and they used to perform. So if you're not familiar with what that would look like, his routine or his ritual, once again, I refer you to YouTube for a look. He was indeed a little bit nuts, Hrabosky was. He would pound the glove and yell at no one in particular as he paced around the mound. He was always getting into scraps with opposing players and would fight with the umps regularly. He earned that nickname of the Mad Hungarian. Now, the fracas really started with Hrabosky, the pitcher, when sort of the Mad Hungarian did his thing, turning his back to leave the batter waiting on him as he performed his routine walking around the mound. Now, the batter again was Madlock, and he was fed up with the distraction and routine, so he decided to do something sort of unexpected. He simply walks away from the batter's box as the Mad Hungarian is doing his routine. So it became a situation of brinkmanship that was building. Then enters the umpire. Now, the plate umpire, Shag Crawford, he orders Madlock back into the batter's box. But to no avail, Madlock's still standing near Jose Cardinal, if any of you remember him as a player, in the on-deck circle for the Cubs. So the ump escalates the situation by telling Madlock and the Cubs manager that he's going to start the inning without anyone in the batter's box, and he's going to call nothing but strikes. So the ump orders Hrabosky to start pitching to an empty batter's box. The Mad Hungarian is loving all this. He eagerly obliges, and that's where the fight begins. He pitches a ball nowhere near the strike zone with no one in the batter box, and the ump calls a strike, true to his word. And as the manager and Cubs players, Jose Cardinal in particular, are arguing with the ump next to the batter's box. Now, this is where what was an argument between, say, umpire and the Cubs' Bill Madlock, and maybe the Cubs manager and Jose Cardinal, it begins to escalate. Because just as Hrabosky is ready to throw a second pitch to an empty batter's box, both Jose Cardinal and Bill Madlock, they both try to jump into the batter's box with their bats at the ready. And Madlock nearly gets hit by the next pitch. And Madlock, by the way, nearly swung at that pitch. And if he would have swung, he would have taken his teammates standing right in front of him, Cardinal's head off. So the Cubs manager was also in the batter's box on the other side of the plate, and it was maybe the most crowded batter's box in the history of baseball. Simmons and Madlock confront each other at that point. After the second pitch, Simmons throws the first punch, and now everyone is swinging away. Both teams are going at it. And remember, back then, base brawls were indeed the real deal. You had punches, tackles, and kicking everywhere, along with the injuries that go with them. And this was one of those wild melees. The remarkable thing is that the only ejected person or player was Marshall, the Cubs manager. Hrabosky, Simmons, and Madlock all stayed in the game, and Simmons basically won the game for the Cards. He had 4 RBIs that day. My opinion is that the umpire is the one who should have been ejected because he definitely instigated and escalated the situation, making what was an initial standoff much worse. Indeed, one of the oddest fights that you'll ever see in baseball history, with some great names from the 1970s as the primary participants. Ted Simmons is in the Hall of Fame, but so should Bill Madlock. Madlock won 4 batting titles in the National League during his career. Get him in the Hall of Fame. Now, one of the truly unique sports dedications for the far middle, and a great way to start episode 180. This episode, we're going to focus on topics that tie together with those famous connections that the far middle is known for. The theme might best be summed up as standards and rule of law, meeting those standards or falling short, getting rule of law right or getting it wrong, and then second chances to get things back on course. I've been really anxious and excited to get to this for some time, so let's get moving. That umpire in our sports dedication, as I said, he sparked a breakdown in order, created a safety hazard for professional players. It reminds me of another entity that we rely upon to institute protocols for the safety of our leaders, and it's become a dysfunctional mess. The stakes are much higher here than the baseball game or player injury from a fight. And I'm speaking of the Secret Service. Now, what we've seen, not just this past summer, where an ex-president and a candidate to become the next president nearly had his head blown off on live TV by a 20-year-old outcast who managed to get on a roof with a rifle within easy shooting distance and get off multiple shots, or even later this past summer when a second incident, another unhinged individual, managed to camp for hours in bushes along a fence line of a Florida golf course where he nearly took a shot at the ex-president and current presidential candidate. Yeah, we could spend an entire episode dissecting all the security failings of those 2 events from this past summer. And as scary as they were, highlighting the ineptitude of the Secret Service, they were just 2 additional proof points added to what's been years of signs of Secret Service degradation with respect to their standards. So let's just run through some of those to put this all in perspective. In 2009, back in 2009, a man and woman who weren't on the guest list were able to attend President Obama's first day dinner as president. They shook his hand, and their credentials were never checked. In 2011, a couple years later, someone took a rifle shot at the White House, and the Secret Service figured out that had happened 4 days after the shot. I've heard of a day late and a dollar short, but never of 4 days late and a shot short. Then there was 2012. I remember this one. Secret Service agents, as in plural, were drinking and spending time with prostitutes in Colombia just hours before they were to be on duty. Nice. In 2014, crazy guy with a knife jumps the fence at the White House, makes it to the East Room before he was apprehended. The next year, 2 off-duty Secret Service agents get drunk, and they drive their car into a security barrier at the White House. In 2017, another guy jumps the fence at the White House, and he saunters around the grounds for over 15 minutes before he's apprehended. And in 2019, a Chinese operative with malware on his flash drive, he gets through a Secret Service checkpoint at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago and makes it all the way to the front desk. And then in 2022, a pair of Secret Service agents had to be sent home from South Korea during President Biden's trip because they got into a fight with a taxi driver while they were drunk. So the 2 frightening events from this summer with President Trump's safety, we should have seen them coming, because the Secret Service is an institution, has been providing us all kinds of warning signs for years and across administrations. The prior director's resignation this summer was a start, but the cultural problems of the Secret Service predate her, and more, much more, needs to be done, and quickly. I want to make a connection to that recently resigned Secret Service director, brings up our next dot to connect to, highlights a potential governance problem when it comes to our Constitution and who is running the executive branch of government the past couple of years, as in who is the acting president. Now, the recently departed director of the Secret Service served on President Biden's detail when he was vice president, and she developed a loyal relationship with the president and his spouse and future first lady. It's been reported the first lady pushed for the appointment of Ms. Cheadle to become Secret Service director, which of course ultimately happened. Now, many want to focus on what that says about what considerations drive decision-making when it comes to putting leaders into important slots. Is it merit? Is it connections? Or is it a host of other things? Now, that's a legitimate point of debate, and it could comprise an entire episode of this podcast. But that's not what I'm interested with regard to this issue. What I'd like to focus on with this thought is that it also raises the question as to who is making the decisions when it comes to running the executive branch of government under the current administration, which granted will soon see a changing of the guard one way or another. The First Lady seems to have exercised outsized and perhaps questionable or even unconstitutional influence. And there were two specific examples that gave me great cause for concern on this front beyond who may have selected the head of the Secret Service. First, in the summer of 2021, if you go back to that period in time, the First Lady posted a picture to her social media accounts showing her studying paperwork at a desk on Air Force One, and the caption of the photo stated, "Prepping for the G7." And then more recently, toward the end of this past summer, the First Lady was seen presiding at the head of the table over the President's cabinet meeting, apparently to speak about research into a specific field she had experience in. And by the way, I believe that was the first cabinet meeting in nearly a year for President Biden. So allow me to be clear on my concern and my point. I've got nothing against first ladies or first gentlemen, and I've had no clue as to how Jill Biden is as a person or with respect to her competencies. She may be the smartest and the nicest person you'd ever want to meet, and first spouses can be very impactful, play impactful roles in presidencies. History has shown that. None of that is actually the point that I'm trying to make. The point is that she was not elected by the voters to be or to act as president. Thus, she shouldn't be acting as president, and the optics you see are indicating that she may have been doing just that. No one should be doing that if they are doing so outside the prescribed governance norms of the United States and its Constitution. If the president is unable to perform the duty of office, there are pretty clear protocols in place that lay out what needs to be done in the interim until another election. It doesn't say in any of those protocols that the First Lady or First Gentleman assumes the responsibilities of their elected spouse. But that is what these two recent examples seem to hint at or indicate is happening. And some may argue that this point is moot because soon we're going to have a new president, as I mentioned. But what's already occurred, if not transparently discussed and course corrected, it sets a dangerous precedent for future administrations or future situations which we can't predict. And that's a precedent that America doesn't need. The protocols have been laid out for a reason. Let's use them when and if they're needed. Let's make a connection jumping from the rules as they relate to succession of power in the executive branch when our president is unable to perform his or her duty to the rules in general when it comes to our legal system. Everyone these days, your host included, seems to be discussing and warning about the dangers of lawfare, whereby different rules and standards are applied to the favored versus the disfavored in our system of justice by government. Now, what are some of the underpinnings of a strong, consistent, transparent, and objective legal system? All those underpinnings are obvious and common sense based, but they've been eroded lately within our legal system, and I thought it would be helpful to review some of them. And there are three of them in particular that are key. Now, the first, or a key tenet of sound legal system, is that the rules are established in advance and they don't change retroactively. Everyone knows what the rules are, and thus you know what you're able to do within the bounds of those rules. Those punished are the ones who decided not to play by the rules that they knew ahead of time, and you can't change the rules in the middle of the game or whenever it might suit you if you are the law. Another good approach or tenet for sound rule of law is that those rules should be universal, as in they apply to everybody, not just those that the system wishes to punish selectively. The Constitution saw the importance of this with its ban on bills of attainder that were designed to prevent rules that would be written specifically for a single person or laws that are designed to get an individual. And then third, a great third tenet would be that the rules need to be clear. If rules are cloudy or complicated or too subjective, it leaves too much room for interpretation by enforcement and by the system. You lose consistency And you go from a situation where no one is above the law to one where everyone is subjected to the whims of the system and how it chooses to selectively enforce the laws. Now, if you don't follow these three basic tenets of a sound legal system, then you run the risk of ending up where the system favors friends and then it's applied to attack enemies. Peruvian dictator Oscar Benavides once summed this up by saying, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law." Let's not have this great republic fall into the trap of poisoning our legal system to where we look more in line with what a dictator may desire versus what our founders intended. This dynamic of what happens when we lose the basic tenets of sound rule of law gets even further complicated when, on top of all this, you add on wide discretion given to bureaucrats and the administrative state via what's known as the Chevron deference or Chevron precedence, which we can make our next connection to. And we talked a bit about this a few episodes back and in the past across the far middle sort of spectrum. And again, thankfully, Chevron precedent was overturned this year by the Supreme Court in the case Loper-Bright. The Supreme Court decades ago in its Chevron decision gave wide discretion to bureaucrats within the administrative state and the executive branch of government to interpret vague statutes as they saw fit, and again, with that very wide discretion. And also, in some instances, it allowed the bureaucrat to impose new regulations where no clear mandate was presented via a statute passed by Congress. Now, that created problems with those three basic core tenets that we discussed under sound rule of law. Rules were changed in the middle of the game whenever the bureaucrat desired so. The rules were not universal because they could be subjectively applied by bureaucrats to different groups or classes, and the rules were far from clear, which made them impossible for private citizens to interpret it and understand, which was all great for the bureaucrat who wished to exert subjective power. But this summer, the Supreme Court righted a wrong with their opinion and decision in Loper-Bright. Chief Justice Roberts, in the majority opinion, clearly stated that the Chevron decision was contradicting the plain text of Section 706 of the APA, which is the Administrative Procedure Act. And the APA, of course, is a statute passed by Congress, but it was passed by Congress way back in 1946. Justice Roberts, in that majority opinion with Loper-Bright, also said the following that a lot of people and experts in the field sort of missed, but I think is really important. He said or wrote, "Perhaps most fundamentally, Chevron's presumption is misguided because agencies have no special competence in resolving statutory ambiguities. Courts do." I think that section of the opinion says a lot. The Supreme Court in Loper-Bright highlighted how the Chevron precedent impeded and violated those checks and balances across the three branches of the federal government that's laid out in the Constitution, how it placed undue power in the executive branch, absolving the legislative branch from doing its job of making law, and precluding the judicial branch from doing its job of judging whether the law was legitimate or constitutional. Roberts continued in the majority opinion by writing, "By forcing courts into pretending that ambiguities are necessarily delegations, Chevron does not prevent judges from making policy, it prevents them from judging." Wow, that's pretty impactful. The wrong-headed, the ill-reasoned Chevron precedent, which is now correctly null and void by the Loper-Bright decision this year, points out perhaps a fourth tenet for sound rule of law in government with the United States and our Constitution. How would we sum up that fourth tenet? Basically, that sound rule of law principle dictates that every federal government action must rest on a law made and passed by Congress, a law that's properly enforced by an objective and consistent executive branch, and a law that is monitored and reviewed under the supervision of an independent judiciary up to and including the Supreme Court. If government's going to exert power and influence over the individual and the private citizen, which all government action requires and results in, it's going to have to do so when all three of those branches of government are working in concert. But under Chevron, you had a situation where too much power, too much delegation as to what the law is, what it says, how it's applied. Too much of that sat with the executive branch and a bureaucrat and the administrative agency. Only one branch of government for the state was exerting influence and power over the citizen. And the Constitution says you need all three branches, not just the executive branch. So Loper Bright was a return to sound government and rule of law. James Madison, one of the founding fathers, saw the danger with Chevron precedent and the need for the return to constitutional normalcy brought by Loper Bright hundreds of years ago. In Federalist number 47, he wrote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." Yeah, he got that right, and he saw the danger coming. Thankfully, the Supreme Court put things back on track with Loper Bright. Time to wrap up 180. It was a fun series of connecting dots in the world of rule of law, standards, and those that we look to enforce it. And what happens perhaps when things go awry, whether it's an umpire losing control in a baseball game, the Secret Service not being able to execute its duty, or the Supreme Court setting a precedent giving unfettered power to bureaucrats, a la the Chevron deference. When those things happen, it's good to go back to revisit what makes for solid standards, a solid justice system, and objective rule of law, and then to hope for those norms to be reinstituted as the Supreme Court did with Loper Bright this year. Indeed, there are fortunately second acts, do-overs, for important institutions and perhaps for all of us in life, which brings me to the second act of one of the biggest celebrities in America in the 1950s and 1960s, Ricky Nelson. And I'm going to start at the end of this story with his hit song from 1972 titled Garden Party. It was Nelson's last top 40 hit, reached number 6 on the charts. It's a great song. I guess you could best describe it as soft rock or country rock with some very interesting, mysterious lyrics. You listen to this song and those lyrics, and it makes you, at least it did for me since I was a kid when I first heard it, wonder, what was he singing about? What is this garden party? What's going on in this song? Well, there is a backstory. So now we will jump to the beginning of Ricky Nelson's story. Ricky was unique when it came to celebrity. From age 8, he starred alongside his family in the radio and TV series, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which was a huge hit. In 1957, he started a long, successful career as a popular recording artist. He actually had an amazing career in its totality. He placed over 50 songs on the Billboard charts and its predecessors, and those hits ranged from 1957 through 1973. He recorded 18 top 10 hits. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 1987, and he also ranks as one of the greatest TV stars of all time. He even enjoyed success on the big screen. He had a motion picture role co-starring alongside John Wayne, Dean Martin, and Angie Dickinson in the Western Rio Bravo. So check out that classic from, I think, 1959 if you like Westerns. But he grew tired of his teen idol typecasting as he got older. And in his 20s, he moved away from pop music and began to perform country rock. And he started to demand the promoters and media don't reference him anymore as Ricky Nelson, and instead refer to him as Rick Nelson. So he went from Ricky to Rick. And he formed the Stone Canyon Band in 1969 and experienced a career resurgence that had a surprise hit with 1972's Garden Party. Now, the song is about when he played Madison Square Garden in New York City as part of the Rock and Roll Spectacular. That bill included Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, and other oldies greats. And all those other greats, they played their old hits. But Rick Nelson played his new material, and he was loudly booed by the crowd. And there was a who's who of rock celebrity on hand to watch the whole sort of series of events unfold. That experience led to the mysterious lyrics of Garden Party. Now here's what some of those lyrics mean. The Garden Party itself was October 15th, 1971, about this time of year back in 1971. And again, that Rock and Roll Spectacular concert at Madison Square Garden. So the Garden Party, Madison Square Garden. When he references My Old Friends in the song, those were fellow performers at the concert, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and the other cast of characters on that epic bill. He references Yoko in his lyrics. That was Yoko Ono, who was in attendance. And he also references Yoko's Walrus. Well, that was John Lennon as in Lennon's song, I Am the Walrus. Mr. Hughes in the lyrics was George Harrison, and the lyric Mr. Hughes hid in Dylan's shoes, that referenced Harrison's planned but later abandoned album of Bob Dylan covers. George Harrison actually planned to do such a thing. In those lyrics, he has a line, I sang a song about a honky-tonk. He's talking about the Rolling Stones song, Country Honk, the song that allegedly caused the booing of Rick Nelson at that concert. And then he penned in the song, I'd rather drive a truck. What's he talking about there? Well, that pays homage to Elvis Presley, who worked for a time as a truck driver, having famously been told after several failed auditions to stick to truck driving because you're never going to make it as a singer. And the song's most famous line is the chorus, but it's all right now. I've learned my lesson well. You see, you can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. Those are words of wisdom from Rick Nelson, reminding us all to do what inspires you and don't focus so much on what everyone else might think. I hope you enjoyed this garden party of the far middle, parading around as episode 180. You can't please everyone, but you can certainly stay connected to that far middle.